The swan's eyes never left the empty nest, her wings drooping with exhaustion. Days passed, and still she refused to leave, until Emily discovered the truth. The mother swan was gravely injured, unable to protect her young, yet she stayed. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. It was a peaceful morning when Emily Carter, a wildlife photographer from Virginia, first noticed the lone swan near the lake's edge. The early light brushed the water's surface with a golden sheen, and from her vantage point above, using the drone's camera, the swan looked majestic, drifting like a spirit over the placid surface of the lake. The drone's lens zoomed in, capturing the swan's pure white feathers against the backdrop of the lush green of the lakeside. Emily had been following this particular swan for months, tracking her movements, documenting her nesting habits, her quiet, elegant life. She had become captivated by the simplicity of the swan's existence, the way she ruled the water with such unspoken authority. But today, something was wrong. The swan had once been a mother to two goslings, tiny and helpless, clinging to their mother's warmth. Emily remembered the first time she had spotted the little family. She'd marveled at the way the mother swan shielded her young beneath the canopy of her wings, as if the entire world could be kept at bay by the sheer force of her love. Those tender moments had been fleeting but beautiful, and Emily had captured them all, piece by piece, each photograph telling a story of innocence, care, and protection. But now the camera was recording something unsettling. The swan had always been protective, always vigilant, but there was no sign of her goslings. Her nest, once nestled between the tall reeds, was eerily empty. The soft down of the young, which had once lined the ground, was gone, washed away by the passage of time and the cycle of life. The mother swan sat still, the weight of her quiet grief hanging heavily in the air. At first, Emily tried to shake off the sense of confusion that settled in her chest. The goslings were old enough to venture into the world. Perhaps they had simply left, as nature intended. But the longer she watched the swan, the more troubling the scene became. The swan did not move. Her wings, usually so full of life and purpose, were still and folded by her sides. She stared across the water, her gaze unblinking, as if waiting for something to return. The absence of her young felt like a wound in the air itself. Emily zoomed in further, watching the mother's quiet form on the shore, her body leaning slightly toward the empty nest, as though she couldn't bear to leave it behind. Why hadn't she left? There had to be more to this. The audience, watching from the drone footage, felt the shift in the atmosphere. Something heavy hung in the air, a question begging to be answered. What was keeping this mother swan tied to her empty nest? It wasn't natural for a swan to stay behind when her young had gone. Was it grief or something deeper, something the camera couldn't capture with a simple frame? Emily's heart twisted as she tried to make sense of the scene, but the answer eluded her. The swan remained as a sentinel, silent, motionless, caught in the grasp of a struggle unseen. Days passed, and the scene grew ever more unsettling. Emily's camera had become more than just a tool for documentation. It was now a window into a tragedy unfolding before her eyes. The swan remained on the lake's edge, unmoving, her gaze fixed on the empty space where her goslings had once been. There was no outpouring of grief, no signs of the mourning that Emily had half expected. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, a silence that stretched too long for comfort. The air itself seemed to tremble with the unspoken tension, as though the lake was holding its breath. Emily's concern deepened. This was no simple moment in the cycle of nature. There was something wrong here. Driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore, she returned to the lake again and again, her drone hovering above the water, always searching for answers. With each visit, the scene remained unchanged, the mother swan guarding her empty nest like a ghost at her post. But the longer Emily watched, the more she began to feel the gravity of the mother's condition. It wasn't just her solitude that seemed unnatural. It was the stillness that clung to her, the way she seemed to withhold any motion, any life. Her wings, once so powerful, lay limp by her side, her body thin and exhausted. It was as though the very act of watching the nest had become a tether, keeping her anchored in place despite the world shifting around her. Then, one afternoon, the moment Emily had been dreading and anticipating came. As she adjusted the drone's angle, she caught a glimpse of something stirring at the far side of the lake. A sudden flash of movement, so small and fleeting, but enough to spark her attention. She quickly repositioned the drone, her heart racing as she focused in on the movement. Slowly, with bated breath, she zoomed in, the lens sharpening the image, revealing the impossible. The nest was no longer empty. The two goslings had returned. But this was not the reunion Emily had imagined. The young swans were not huddled together with their mother. They stood apart, separated by a thin strip of water, their fragile bodies teetering on the edge of survival. Emily's stomach twisted with a sudden, terrible understanding. The goslings were not there out of love or affection. They were back because they were struggling to survive on their own. The harsh truth of nature had finally sunk in. As Emily watched, she could see the distress in the young swans' movements. They were hesitant, struggling against the rising water that now separated them from the shore. Their once innocent steps were uncertain, faltering, as the relentless pull of the water threatened to sweep them away. Yet, there was no sign of the mother's usual urgency, no frantic call to rally her young. The mother swan remained where she had been for days, her eyes never leaving the goslings, her body unmoving. She watched them with an intensity that spoke of helplessness more than love. And then came the realization, sharp and sudden. The mother was not refusing to move. She was unable to. The drone footage revealed the depth of her suffering. Her wing was badly injured, a deep gash that ran along the length of it, leaving the once proud creature grounded. She could not fly to her young, could not wade through the water to reach them. She had not remained at her post out of some misplaced sense of duty or unwillingness to let go. No, she had stayed because she was physically incapable of leaving. Her body, once a vessel of power and grace, was now a prison. The deep cut on her wing had made movement impossible. Emily's heart sank as she pieced together the cruel truth. This mother had been bound to her nest not by choice, but by injury, left to watch the world unfold in painful silence while her young fought for their survival. The nature of the struggle was no longer just about the mother's devotion. It was about survival itself. The brutal, unforgiving reality of the wild had laid bare its cost. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Would the mother swan ever have the chance to reunite with her goslings? Or had fate already made its decision? The realization hit Emily like a tidal wave, overwhelming and undeniable. As her drone hovered above the lake, capturing the stillness below, she understood the profound truth that had eluded her until now. The mother swan had stayed not out of stubbornness or neglect, but out of an unwavering devotion to her children. Even when incapacitated by injury, even when her body had failed her, her love for her goslings had anchored her to that nest. It wasn't just the silence of the lake that spoke to Emily now. It was the silent language of a mother who would never abandon her young, no matter the cost. The goslings, too, had not remained in one place out of simple desire. They had found shelter near a patch of reeds, huddling together for warmth and protection from the growing threat of predators. Their movements were slow, uncertain, as they navigated a world that was no longer the safe haven it had once been. The water had risen, the predators had come, and the reality of survival was written in the desperate, wary eyes of the young swans. Yet, despite their newfound refuge, they were still alone in a world that had turned hostile. The sight of them, so small and fragile against the vast lake, was enough to choke Emily's throat. But what struck her even more profoundly was the stark contrast between their courage and the stillness of their mother. As the hours passed, the mother's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her once proud, strong body seemed to wither before Emily's eyes. Each movement was labored, each breath shallow. She had stayed, not because she had chosen to, but because her love for her goslings had refused to let her leave. The weight of her sacrifice pressed heavily upon Emily's chest as she continued to record, her camera capturing the inevitable conclusion to this heartbreaking chapter. The mother swan was fading. Her wings lay limp against her sides, the once majestic feathers now matted with the wear of her prolonged vigil. The truth finally revealed itself in the quiet tragedy of the moment. The mother had never abandoned the nest. She had stayed because she could not bear the thought of her goslings facing the world alone. Her refusal to move, her enduring stillness, had not been out of stubbornness, but out of a primal, fierce love. She had given everything, even when she knew she had nothing left to give. It was in this final act of sacrifice that her strength, her quiet, steadfast love, shone brightest. In the face of her own demise, the mother swan had done what mothers do best: protect, even at the cost of their own survival. And then, in the last frame of the footage, Emily captured the moment the mother swan's head slowly lowered, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Her eyes fluttered closed, the fight gone from her. It was a poignant, serene end, as though the very act of surrendering was a form of release, a final peace after a life spent in service to her young. Yet the story did not end with the mother's passing. In the far distance, Emily could see the goslings, small but resolute, still navigating the dangers of the wild. The perilous night had passed, and though they had lost their mother, they had survived. In their quiet struggle, they embodied the unspoken legacy of their mother's sacrifice. The footage ended, and Emily's heart felt heavy with grief, but also with a profound understanding of the depths of a mother's love. True love, she realized, knows no boundaries. It transcends all: survival, pain, even death itself. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not in the grand gestures, but in the simple, unyielding act of staying, of enduring, even when it hurts. Though the mother swan had passed, the message of her love would linger, woven into the hearts of those who watched her story unfold. Her sacrifice would live on, a testament to the quiet strength that defines unconditional love. Emily knew that this story, this final act of devotion, would resonate far beyond the lake, inspiring those who witnessed it to believe in the power of love that never falters, even in the face of the harshest trials.